Oh, waiting. Okay, we're live. All right. I, again, am your moderator, David Walters, like I will be the entire day. Just a quick note, since this is live, feel free to drop comments, questions, whatever you want to do, and we'll try to pick some out as time allows. But without going through my whole spiel again, let's go ahead and get some introductions from our panel. But whoever wants to start, I guess we'll start with Peter. We'll just kind of go across and down and over, if that works for you guys. Peter?
Sure. I do apologise. I'm not really here. I'm having ridiculous technology problems at my end. So anyway, I am Peter McLean. I work in IT. An absolute shamefaced admission. I work in IT and I can't work this laptop, which in my defence is somebody else's. But I am the author of War for the Rose Throne, Priest of Bones and Priest of Lies. And coming hopefully next year, Priest of Gallows will be the third but not necessarily final instalment. And what else? I also write for Black Library, write Warhammer stuff. And in the past, I wrote a series of urban fantasy novels called the Burn Man series. Fantastic. And that's me.
Dave?
Hi, Dave Wragg. I'm the author of The Black Hawks, which is the first of the Articles of Faith series, and the second of those will be along eventually. And that's pretty much it.
Easy enough. Ben?
Hello, I'm Ben Galley. I'm UK author of dark, epic, anything grim fantasy. Been writing and publishing for 10 years. I'm the author of the Emaneska series, standalone Heart of Stone, and recently Chasing Graves trilogy, which is all about ghosts and dying and defecating in lockboxes, apparently, from the start of the book. If you read the first chapter, you'll know what I mean.
All right, Rob.
Yeah, hi, I'm Rob Hayes. I'm another UK author. I've written mostly dark and sort of epic fantasy, things like Ties That Bind trilogy, Never Die, and most recently the War Eternal trilogy, which is finishing in 9 days' time. The final book comes out in 9 days' time.
Great work.
Oh, book plug. All right, Anna.
Hi, I'm Anna Stevens, the author of the Godblind trilogy, which is clearly now complete because there's 3 of them there. They are apparently grimdark. My new series is out on the 12th of November. The series is The Songs of the Drowned, and the first book is The Stone Knife.
Fantastic. And I think we have officially lost Peter, except for the fact that he's kind of still here. It looks like he's muted.
Oh
so Peter will be along
He's
at some point
swearing.
Again.
I swear this is when we realised Peter's actually an AI program.
I know.
I may have been.
There he is.
So apparently the thing I need to start isn't installed on this laptop. So you're going to have to live with just my dulcet tones, I'm afraid.
If you guys want to see what he looks like, he's on Twitter.
Just a giant eye at the moment. He's like the eye of Sauron.
So we'll kind of just start with our panel topic. So panel is called Grimdark, Grimheart, or just low fantasy. You decide. So anyone, please feel free to take the floor. But do any of you know the difference between the 3?
I like to think I do, but I'm probably wrong.
Sounds like a trick question.
Grimdark even mean?
My simple definition, I tried to do some homework for this panel, so I've written a few things down. So I've got Grimdark, trying to break it down. The rough kind of explanation I've got is Grimdark is wading through shit. Grimheart is wading through shit with friends. And low fantasy is there might not be any shit at all, but you still got to go somewhere. I'm still working on the low fantasy area, but that's kind of roughly what I've got. You know, it's all about grit, and there's horrible shit to go through, and it's all about survival, and maybe some redemption in the end. You know, black humor along the way. Grimheart's a bit more about friendship, maybe a bit about who knows, a bit more emotion, a bit more feelings, and then low fantasy I think is just kind of more of a definition of the contents of it rather than high fantasy. So it's literally that within that spectrum, within the high fantasy and low fantasy sides of things. So I'm going to put that out there. That's it.
It's pretty dang close. Anybody else?
Well, I can't take credit for this. I can't take credit for this one, but R.J. Barker once, bless him, said that Grimdark is historical fantasy for people who would quite like a wizard to have been there.
Nice.
And Dave, since you're on the outside kind of looking in on this, what do you think?
Well, yeah, I went to Wikipedia earlier.
I did that.
Just to see, because it's all about preparation, isn't it, Ben?
Of course.
And what was interesting was that even on Wikipedia, they were under the definition section, you got like 4 divergent ideas of what it could be. And 3 of them were sneering, but one of them was Jared Shuren's, which I quite liked, where he described it as a sort of, I've got it up here, it's a fantasy Protestantism, where the 3 key components are a grim and dark tone, obviously, a sense of realism, for example, monarchs are useless and heroes are flawed, and the agency of the protagonists, as opposed to high fantasy where everything is predestined. So there's a rejection of that sort of notion of destiny and prophecies and all the rest of it, and instead you've got that more kind of realistic tone. And especially, I mean, that I could fit right in with. The grim and dark tone is presumably implied by the name, but then of course the name itself is ironic, so your money may vary, mileage may vary.
Your money may vary too.
Yeah, depending on rates of exchange and all the rest of it. So I was quite the notion of fantasy Protestantism. I quite like that.
Yeah. But I think everyone's got their own definition. There's like there are those kind of 3 or 4 things that everyone agrees with. But it's apart from that, it's just a sliding scale. I mean, there's so many people who say that my books aren't grimdark. Then there are other people who say that they're the height of grimdark. And I'm like, I think it is extremely subjective. It is down to each individual reader at the end of the day. But yeah, they've all got shit and shit with friends. And that's
everybody in the world's a shit as well.
Yeah.
But then only the notion of the sort of the original Grimdark of versus Grimheart, shit with friends versus shit without friends. Most of the Grimdark books I would think of still feature the friendship stuff. So I'm quite curious as to what elevates something to be called Grimheart. Beyond Grimdark without the friendship stuff is just nihilistic, and you're back to the Warhammer 40,000, which is I remember reading the short fiction in White Dwarf in the late 80s, thinking, oh my god, this is amazing, everything's so dark and nothing's good anywhere. And then you look back at it later and like, actually, that was nihilism, wasn't it? There really wasn't anything to celebrate about it at all. Everyone's dead. So that, I mean, it's a niche, but I don't think you can have a whole mainstream body of fiction like that. Or can you?
It just gets, I mean, the thing is, for me, when I started out thinking, I write epic and dark fantasy, and, I had some dark elements to my original series, and then started to kind of get more dark. I don't know why, maybe it's something I was reading. And then kind of, the big discussion of Grimdark came out. So I set out to write several Grimdark books, but actually looking back on them and I kind of cheered as well as doing research. I've just got Peter's blog post on Grimdark versus Grimheart, and I can just steal it. I'm not gonna. I'm not gonna. But when that I came across that and doing the research, and I realized maybe I do write Grimheart instead of Grimdark, because there are always, I think, black humor is a part of both Grimdark and Grimheart. And I think of low fantasy because there has to be a balance to that grit and to that amoral violence that we have. So I think, I always like the humor. I always like the friendships, even if the POV is very narrow and it's all about the protagonist's, feelings. It's all about, his POV. And so he's kind of an island or a wolf, like a lone wolf. So his friends are there, but they're periphery. They don't matter to him. Maybe a bit like, Broken Empire trilogy. So, but I think I find that I actually do like the friendship side of things, the quest, the band, the humor. I quite like it when people don't all die at the end, even though I do really enjoy killing fictional characters by the hundreds, thousands even. Maybe I do write Grimheart.
Is it as simple as the ending?
I've only heard Grimheart actually the term used once before. Before this sort of panel. The only other time I've heard it, I think, was Ed McDonald, because he described his own books as Grimheart, because he basically wrote a love story set in a grimdark world.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of why I brought it into the fold, just because he kind of created the term based off Grimdark, but he's like, it's not grim because it's a love story. It's romantic. It's just it is in a super dark, shit-filled world because everything everything's bull of shit apparently. And just FYI, I'm pretty sure there's an this is obviously kidding, but there is a Shit for Friends app on iPhone. I'm pretty sure it's kind of like Words with Friends, but it's a lot dirtier. But yeah, so the definitions that I pulled, and I had to take my glasses off for this. The definitions I pulled for it: grimdark is a subgenre of speculative fiction with a tone, style, or setting that is particularly dystopian, amoral, or violent. Grimheart, as Ed McDonald puts, appears like grimdark at first glance, but is actually about the value of love and friendship. And then low fantasy or intrusion fantasy is a subgenre of fantasy fiction where magical events intrude on an otherwise normal world. Now, the only reason I brought low fantasy into this is because I know a lot of people have said that Pete McLean's War for the Rose Throne series is grimdark. Pete, would you say it's grimdark, or would you say it's low fantasy, or would you say it's both?
I think it's more of a low fantasy. I think grimdark is, when it became popular, it became the marketing phrase of the day, I think. And publishers like to push things as being grimdark, whether they are or not. That's hard it goes back to what your definition of grimdark is. I mean, as I write for Warhammer, I have a very specific definition of what grimdark is, and that's not what I write in Rose Throne. Is it happy princesses riding sparkling unicorns? No. Not one tiny little bit. I don't regard it as particularly grimdark, but then I'm a fairly bleak nihilistic person, to be honest with you. So is it going to have a happy ending? Depends who you want it to be happy for, I suppose, really. But no, I regard it. Oh, bloody Anne. Now, would I do anything to hurt bloody Anne? Would I?
Yes, bloody would.
You're a fine one to talk.
Touché.
But no, I would regard it more as low fantasy. It's a sort of alternative historical setting with a wizard.
Yeah. I feel like a lot of people, when they read a novel or they see a novel come across, and maybe depending on the cover or the synopsis, or if they read it and they say this has got a very dark tone, they automatically put, oh, it's grimdark. And it's unfortunately that's kind of what everybody does. And it's obviously, I mean, it's maybe the case a quarter of the time. A lot of it's just epic fantasy that does have a dark tone to it, but does have redeeming qualities, or it does have maybe some kind of love story in between, or it has a sparkling ending, as Pete likes to put it. But do any of you actually set out to write stories inside of any of these genres? Don't talk at once.
I suppose so. Yeah, I mean, I wanted to write low fantasy with very little magic in it. I think the first draft of Priest of Bones didn't actually have any magic in it at all. And my editor at the time pointed out that he couldn't sell a fantasy book with no magic in, that I still don't quite disagree with. Don't quite agree with, even. I mean, I read KJ Parker's 16 Ways to Defend a Walled City, which is really good, by the way. No magic in it whatsoever, but it's definitely a fantasy novel because it isn't historical. It doesn't happen on Earth. So what else can it be but a fantasy novel? But yeah, I mean, I knew from the outset there weren't going to be dragons or elves or anything like that in it. It was just going to be people in a fairly realistic historical world.
Yeah, I mean, I've had people talk about the magic in my trilogy, and I'm like, no magic. There is no magic in my trilogy. There are gods, and there are gods that play a very direct role in the lives of people, but there's no actual magic. I mean, a God-given gift is not a magical ability, at least not in my definition. So no, I don't, I don't quite subscribe to that we can't sell a fantasy book if it doesn't have magic in. I saw Dave pointing at the Blackhawks, which I have read, and yes, does not have any magic in.
Yeah.
So, you know, clearly you can sell fantasy books that don't have any magic.
I agree.
But
I
as to
do wonder
whether
if our editors learned that now.
But as to whether I set out to write a Grimdark or Grimheart or low fantasy book, I mean, I definitely set out to write an epic fantasy book because that is my first great love of you know, of books. I certainly didn't set out to make it as dark as it ended up. I mean, I've told this story several hundred times now, but the very first draft of Godblind was high fantasy, which is quite hilarious when you think about it. But I basically set out to write an epic love story in a fantasy world, and that's where we ended up. So as far as I'm concerned, it is still a love story. It's 3 love stories effectively, but it's definitely set in a, you know, quite bleak world and in some fairly catastrophic scenarios.
I think I did the same with Heart of Stone, because I set out to write pure grimdark with a military, well, I thought pure grimdark with a military twist. You know, I'm going to plug it. Heart of Stone was designed to be that sort of thing where, you know, you're right in the middle of the war. I've got an excuse to be as dark as possible. And let's face it, I think, you know, without going back into the definitions of what Grimdark and Grimheart are, I think that, I mean, there's so much darkness in the world without fiction. I mean, if you look at some of the news stories, if you're a murder nut like my partner Rachel is, and always telling me these stories, you know, there's plenty of darkness to be found in the real world. So I wanted to highlight that, especially, you know, in things like war, where everyone has an excuse to be violent, an excuse to hate, and therefore I think, you know, the darker stories come to the surface. So I wanted to write that, but then I found that I couldn't just keep it as this mindless creature destroying things and have just his emotion. I couldn't just tell that. So, you know, I mean, the clues in the title with Heart of Stone, there's way more emotion in it, and it does maybe verge out of Grimdark into Grimheart because, yeah, it's a love story between 2 friends. Less romantic love, more about just, yeah, almost familial friendship love. And yeah, it's Grimdark with heart and soul, as Anna Smith put it. But yeah, so I'd set out to write something dark, and then somehow humanity and niceness crept in. I don't know how. I did the same thing with Chasing Green.
It's the unicorns that you've got in your soul that are just trying to get out.
I keep trying to kill them with alcohol, but it doesn't work.
But you know, I mean,
most people set out to actually write grimdark, though. I mean, maybe there are some in sort of the genre, like Black Library writers who they're writing to that particular genre. But I think most people just sort of set out to write their story, and if it turns out quite dark, it just gets labelled as grimdark. Quite often, if you know, if there's sometimes it only takes one dark scene. I'm looking at Anna here, and then suddenly the book gets labelled as grimdark for the rest of the time.
Yeah,
so, yeah.
I think it's almost got to a point. Go on, Anna.
I was just going to say, I was talking to Devin Madsen, who's got We Ride the Storm coming out next month, and a lot of people have been saying that We Ride the Storm is grimdark because it features a religious practice where you remove the head of a dead person, but it's an act of honor. So you basically take the head and you take it away with you, and it's like a burial rite thing. And people are like, oh yeah, well that's grimdark, and it's like it's not. It's a religious practice. I mean, it's not one that we would do, but it doesn't automatically make it grimdark. And I think a lot of people are making these associations now and saying, oh, you've got this one thing, therefore you're writing grimdark. And I think it does kind of, it detracts from what else authors are trying to do. I mean, to sound slightly pretentious and poetic, you know, the darker the background is, the lighter the love story is, for example. You know, you're showing it up in stark relief because the background, everything else that's going on is so awful that, you know, where you do get these moments of hope and light and love and whatever, and fluffy kittens, it's so much more impactful. And that was something that I was definitely trying to do, was to make the impact of the good stuff so much stronger, because it was these small little flashes against this unrelenting bleakness.
Yeah, it's like white paint on a black canvas rather than grey on grey, even though our characters are morally grey.
I've always thought that the idea of Grimdark is probably more about the contrast. So, you know, yeah, in this sort of world full of shit, you find a few diamonds and they shine all the more brightly because they're surrounded by shit. I
wrote that down. I literally got that, and then went for the wading analogy.
Guys are stealing each other's notes.
We are the same person, so you know we're all Dirk.
Working on the
beard. But yeah, I mean that's how I basically thought when I was writing my first sort of trilogy. It was like I was trying to make quite a dark world. Yeah, so the loyalty and friendship that grows between the main characters just stood out all the more sort of brightly. Really, it's just that sort of contrast.
So I think grimdark has become that phrase for something that contains something grim and or dark. It doesn't necessarily, to a lot of people, mean a certain, you know, splinter genre or subgenre or niche that has a set tone, which I think, you know, we've all agreed is a bit nihilistic. So I think, yeah, someone's like, oh, you've got a scene where, yeah, there's the head cutting off, or I don't know, something in my books. It's like, oh, that's horribly grim and dark. It's grimdark. It's like, well, it's not.
No,
as soon as somebody gets stabbed, it's grimdark.
Yeah, exactly. We've almost got to a point where anything that isn't explicitly high fantasy gets called grimdark, for want of calling it something else. Which, yeah, I don't think it's all that constructive, to be perfectly honest.
Well, I was wondering where
use it as a term to exclude sort of things. It's like that polarizing thing where somebody will say, "Oh, it's a bit dark. It's grimdark. I don't like grimdark." Or there's other people that sit there and go, "Oh, it's got a bit of darkness in it. I love grimdark. That one's definitely for me."
I wonder where that dividing line is, as in, you know, that almost the Disneyfication thing, like in Disney films made for quote young adult children, where there's no blood. You can have extraordinary acts of violence, but there's no blood, and they don't show the blood, and that's the high fantasy angle. You know, people firing lasers or bullets at each other and people falling down dead, but no severed limbs, no guts hanging out, that kind of thing. Whereas you cross over that threshold and suddenly you're in the new realm of sort of grimdark equivalent, where yes, you know, the opening of Saving Private Ryan, for example, could be compared to a 70s war film in terms of number of bullets fired and number of people killed, but the effect is obviously quite starkly different. So is that where we are with, you know, high fantasy, cross the threshold, blood, there you are, grimdark, that's it, and there's nothing in between?
Yeah, because like high fantasy isn't grimdark because the people are just killed with magic. They aren't killed with real world items, I guess.
And also they were bad.
Yeah,
they were bad people, so all of their deaths were deserved. Whereas when bad things happen to good people, that's dark. That's grimdark.
I'm just thinking whether it's like, because I mean, Dave, you asked about, you know, endings. Is it endings and down to the conclusion of the story? And I always think like it's kind of, there is an ending, there is a conclusion, there is a form of redemption in most pure grimdark book. You know, the darkest of the dark, and we kind of think that, you know, that's, I don't know, there is an ending somewhere, but I think it's not necessarily a good ending for the character. It's just an ending. You know, there's something's completed, something's saved. Usually not them, but something is saved. And you know, they might die, they might not, but it's ended. Whatever has gone on. It's a bit like Saving Private Ryan is a good example of that. If someone hasn't seen it, there's going to be a spoiler here, but obviously, you know, he dies at the end.
Private Ryan dies?
If you haven't seen it, that's on what's his face? Oh no, wait, does he? Either way, at the end, it's not happy.
Oh yeah, 100%.
Yeah. So in terms of that, does he? He doesn't die, does he?
He's so hot.
You know,
Diesel dies.
Plot twist.
That's it. Vin Diesel. Either way, people die. You know, it's satisfying, but it's an ending, but it's not satisfying. I think, you know, the lighter you got spectrum, then I think the more satisfying the ending becomes. You know, the happier the ending might become in terms of that. So, I don't know. There you go. Hanks, I knew Hanks died. Thank you, Steve.
We get it.
It's been that long. I haven't
Spoilers.
watched it.
kind of going back to it now, Anna, I have to say, Mark Lawrence did the, Grimdark, we're nailing it down post, and it's been kind of updated as books progress and come out and so forth. You're still sitting at number 5.
Am I really?
Yeah.
It's the hammer effect, Anna.
So it's Michael Fletcher, Beyond Redemption, R. Scott Baker's The Darkness That Comes Before, Mark's own book, Prince of Thorns. I don't think you should be on that list. You can't make your own list and then
see what he's done there.
Yeah, exactly. Quarter Broken Knives by Anna Smith Spark, and then Godblind.
Wow.
How do you feel about that, Anna?
Grimdark.
Yeah, Grimdark.
I mean, it is what it is. I think I don't know whether the books maintain that sort of level of bleakness all the way through. I think they probably do, but I think I would actually say that the second one is probably the darkest, the bleakest, because it's it's just a month-long siege of a city in which people are dying and sacrificing themselves and all sorts of things, and then it doesn't, spoilers, but it doesn't end with a successful defense of the city. So I would say that one is, in a way, I would say that one is probably the darkest of the 3, because the third one, there's an awful lot of bad stuff happens, but it's got a slightly more hopeful ending. But as to being number 5 on the list, I'm absolutely thrilled. So yeah, you should all go out and buy it and read it. And buy it for your friends as well.
Yeah, just get a big 5.
Just number 5.
Everybody should just go out and buy it and then decide for themselves, right?
Precisely. Yeah.
So since you all are kind of in these genres as far as what people believe your books portray, what is it like being attached to a certain mold? Do you think any books you write in the future are always going to be attached to that, no matter if they're more lighthearted or, good Lord, you even switch to a different genre? People are going to be like, oh, they write Grimdark, I'm never going to read that. Do you feel like it hinders your readership at all when you attempt to branch out?
I experienced that, I think. But you go. Tiana.
No, carry on.
I thought, when I started out, I wrote the original 4 Manesca books, which were dark epic fantasy. You couldn't call them low fantasy because there's tons of dragons in them, but they are dark and they are epic. They verge on grimdark elements, but they are pure epic fantasy, giant cities, countries against each other, things like that. And then I was kind of like, not done with it, but I had all these other ideas from just, writing in 4 books. You get other ideas pop up. And so I went Western fantasy and alternate history and wrote a weird alternative world in 1867 for my second series. From a marketing standpoint, possibly not the best thing to do, because I think, the brand was all about that dark and epic fantasy set in the Nordic frozen world. And to go to Wyoming in 1867 was a bit of a switch for my readers. And I think that, even though I found new readers, I think, yes, people were kind of looking to see more Manesca at the time, which is why I've gone back to, things like The Heart of Stone, which was epic and dark, military, and it was set in basically England. So it's always grimdark in England because it always rains as well. And then, I've kind of stuck with the epic fantasy.
That's the association. That's what it is.
That's it. It's grimdark if it's set in an English-style country and it's raining.
If you set a story in an English-style world, then it's grimdark.
That's it. But to answer the question, I think, people did expect more epic fantasy. And I think, doing polls and asking fans and chatting to people over the last decade or so, people are saying, where's more Manesca? Oh, you write the dark stuff. And I think, trying to break out of that was a mistake at the start, and I think now also people would be like, what are you doing? So I think I'm sort of in I wouldn't say a niche or in a rut, but I'm definitely in a small canyon. I've got room to move around, but I'm still in one direction.
I gotcha. Peter, you want to go, since you've written 2 different series that are completely different?
I kind of changed genre. So the first series I wrote is modern day set urban fantasy with demons and hitmen and gangsters and things. So I didn't change genres exactly because it's all fantasy, but I definitely changed subgenres, with Priest of Bones being set in roughly about 1450 kind of thing. So I did have a few people that were fans of the first series sort of say, dude, what the fuck is this? There's horses everywhere. So yeah, it's a difficult thing, but I wouldn't want to be shackled to just riding one thing forevermore. I don't think of anything duller, to be honest with you. So I mean, the next thing I write after War for the Rose Throne will probably still be fantasy, but a different type of fantasy. One day I might like to write a straight crime novel, So I think from a marketing brand perspective, that's where initials come in. Maybe put that out as PR McLean or something, or possibly a complete pen name. I know somebody who's recently assumed a completely different name. Now she's changed genres. I don't know. That's a conversation to have with my agent when the time comes, I suppose. But I think, as Ben says, your name can become a brand that people expect a certain type of fiction from. Definitely, yeah.
Anybody else want to chime in?
Yeah, I think my new series is definitely less grimdark. It may not even be grimdark at all. Again, depending on your definition. But it is very different. This time there's definite overt magic in it. This time there's definitely overt a type of monster in it this time, which I haven't had at all before. So I have been having some sort of quiet heart palpitations about what people are actually going to think and how it's going to be received and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, I thought I spent basically my entire writing life to date in the Godblind universe, and I could write another trilogy in that universe without even thinking about it, because I'm so familiar with it and I know it inside out. But I didn't want to do that immediately after the first trilogy. I wanted to do something that was very different. I wanted to prove that I could write in a different universe. So I just decided to throw in all of the stuff that I hadn't got in the first trilogy. And my God, have I regretted it every day since. It is so hard to write a magic system that has any kind of rules to it. So that's all still quite nebulous, actually. It's just like, it's magic, pizzazz, so there's no there's no rules to it. It's like,
never apologize, never explain.
That's the best kind of magic system.
Exactly.
A wizard did it.
So a little bit nervous about how it's going to be received, but also quite excited about what people are going to think about it within the general mind-numbing terror that comes with releasing a book. Anyway, there's like a spark of excitement as well
somewhere.
Rob, what about you?
Yeah, well, I did that. My first trilogy was obviously quite dark. A lot of people do describe it as grimdark, and I'm not going to argue with them. And then the next books I released were happy steampunk capers with thieves, a couple of conmen, and there was quite a lot of blowback to it. Never really sold particularly well, and a lot of people left pretty horrible reviews saying, "What is this crap? This isn't more of the ties that bind." So yeah, there's quite a bit of blowback with that one, and I thought, okay, I'll go back to the other world. So there definitely can be that sort of branding, I think, with the name. As to the term of sort of grimdark being attached to it, I think that happens as well. I've had plenty of people describing Never Die, my Asian fantasy, as grimdark, and I'm just sort of thinking, it's about heroes. There's literally about a bunch of heroes who have a second shot at sort of redemption and wandering across the world to try and kill an evil emperor. It's not grimdark in the slightest. But it's just that term has just sort of been attached to me, I think, in many ways, which may have been brought about by myself. My latest trilogy was supposed to be a YA thing. It did not turn out to be a YA thing. It's quite dark. So, I mean, I think that's what happens when you try and set a YA thing in a prison.
Usually.
I love how he says YA and everybody's like, ugh.
I give it a go, and then I set it in a prison underground where there's no light and there's demons and everything, and it turned out you can't do YA like that, so whatever. It's dark.
I think that's the thing, though. People love to write. I mean, everyone here will have the stories that we like to read and what we like to write, and we have the ideas that we want to write. And I think it's amazing that we have the freedom to do that. Whether you're traditionally published or indie published, there is the freedom to do that these days. And there is also an audience out there. Usually, unless you're writing, I don't know, asparagus fantasy or something like that. I don't know, like Veggie Tales. I don't know. It's the first thing that came to my head.
Somebody go ahead and jot that down. Somebody do Grimdark Veggie Tales. I swear it will sell.
That's it. Yeah. Either way, there's an audience, right? So I mean, it's a shame when I see an author feel like they are pigeonholed into, this is what I have to write now. I have to write Grimdark for the rest of my life, because it's down to the author. They're the storyteller, the entertainer. Let them entertain. But yeah, I think the fans will cross over if they're that interested.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like a fandom is based on not just what an author writes about, but the writing itself, whether they find it entertaining. I myself, I don't care, as long as I don't have a fantasy writer going straight into soppy romance or something like that. I'm like, okay, I like you, but I'm probably not going to be the reader for that. And I think that's what it is. I think there's a readership for certain genres, and whether or not somebody follows you throughout your entire career, they'll probably read what they're more in tune to reading. I don't think it should shut people, down from reading your books. But if it's not your thing, go to the next thing, or go to somebody like that author. And then when they come back, maybe if they write another novel in that genre that you enjoy, then read it. There's no sense in bashing them for trying something new. I mean, it's like people, yelling at George R.R. Martin every time he posts on Twitter about something new. They're like, "Where's the next book?" He's not writing for you.
Yeah.
Honestly, I do think
between fans and authors.
I think the picking on George Martin thing is getting out of hand now, to be honest. I don't know if you saw Mark Lawrence had a blog post about this the other day, but it really is a sense of entitlement that is just not right.
Yeah, and it's been going on for years. I mean, they do the same thing with Rothfuss. They've done the same thing with Lynch. I mean, there's all these authors out there that if I saw all that, it would make me want to write slower. Because I'm like, if you're gonna try to somewhat force my hand via social, media or something, I'm like, you know what? I'm going to take my sweet time. Exactly. Yeah. And just be like, I'll get it out when I get it out. And I feel like it's exactly what I want to portray. And I think that's what Martin's doing. I mean, he's written such a massive world with all of these character storylines that if one thing is off, and you're going to have people that are going to nitpick everything anyway, because everybody has an opinion. But it's not up to everybody else. And it kind of goes back to the genre thing. It's like, if an author wants to write something different, who cares? Let them enjoy it. That's the idea that came to them, and that's what they want to write about. And if it's your thing, read it. If it's not, okay. Nope. It doesn't matter.
Yeah. I think it's like what you said earlier about it's not just what you're writing, but it's how you write. Because Jen Williams has got a thriller out next year called Dog Rose Dirt. And Jen Williams is an auto buy for me. So although I don't read a huge amount of thrillers, because I love the way Jen writes and I love the epic levels of snark that she has, I know that that's going to be somewhere in the thriller. And therefore, I'm absolutely going to buy that book when it comes out, because I love Jen. I love the way she writes. I love the way she constructs character. And I'm actually really intrigued to see how she deals with, the real world rather than fantasy world. So yeah, because of her tone and her characterization and things like that, I'm going to buy it, even though that's not a genre that I would normally buy. And also, just going back to names, I know that people tried to say that she was slightly grimdark, which I think is hilarious. But then someone else coined the phrase for her trilogies as Glee Dark, which I just thought was amazing. Because it was just like, she does take so much rampant joy in just having all of the fantasy tropes and just giving a big fuck you to everyone. And
why not?
so Glee Dark for Jen, which I thought
I've always thought
another
Wragg
G
is
term.
she's a one-woman genre, that one.
Yeah, certainly to add, I mean, my experience as a reader going back over many years is that if I really like an author's work, irrespective of the genres they write in, thinking back to the people I read all through my teens and 20s, you exhaust all their fantasy books, you move on to the sci-fi books, and then you even read the standalone books just because it's written by them and because you like the way they do things. So, Jen being a classic example of that.
I do the same thing with music. I think music and, I mean, you can draw a lot of parallels through the creative markets and industries anyway. But I think music and the book are very, very close together. And then, if you like an artist, you like them usually for the artist, even if they do suddenly switch into Bavarian punk.
K-pop.
Metallica did a folk album, didn't they? That didn't work for me.
I did struggle with late period Blur, though. Yeah.
It's just something you have on in the background. You don't really pay attention to it, but you've got it. So. I mean, I feel like I guess the same thing can be said about those big name authors as well. Kind of like your Stephen King. I mean, everybody kind of thinks that he has to write in this specific thing, but every novel that he writes, now some kind of have the same horror aspects, but a lot of them, like, they're not scary. They have just kind of teensy little bits here and there, but they're all completely original stories. And there's specific audiences for each one of his series or sets of novels or something. But, there are still people today that go, gosh, I can't believe Stephen King wrote that. Like a lot of people don't like a specific character in his Bill Hodges trilogy, which she's now gotten, I think, 2 short stories since he's written that, and people still complain about it. I'm like, then don't read it. if it makes you so upset that you're going to go on social media and just bash them, then maybe it's not for you.
Yeah. Well, there's more than enough Stephen King to go around anyway.
Exactly. It's like, you know what? If you just started reading Stephen King 5 years ago, I promise you there is tons of stuff in the backlog that you can go check out.
But is Dark Tower, is that fantasy, would you say?
Oh yeah, I'd say it's more intrusive, but I'd say it's dark fantasy.
Fantasy.
Is it low fantasy? Because bad things happen to good people in that.
We need another panel.
Sorry,
I know.
Another
panel just to talk about that. All right, so kind of going back to kind of fitting in molds. Obviously we talk about readers and how they want to attach you to certain things. Do your editors or publishers give you any sort of grief or hesitation, like, really, come on, keep doing the grim stuff, or are they very open to reading whatever you hand them? I mean, I would figure as an editor or publisher, you kind of need to, if said author is doing very well, they need to kind of see anything and everything you send over, right?
Well, that's implying any of us are doing very well, so thank you for that.
Wow, Pete, way to keep it grim.
It hasn't really come up, to be honest, because when I change genres, I change publishers anyway. So, we'll have to wait and see with that one, I think.
I mean, I know because Dave and I share an agent, and I know that when I was initially. Hi, Harry. I know that when I was initially talking to Harry about what I might do after the Godblind trilogy, and I sort of mentioned, I said, well, I did, like, 10 years ago, I wrote a very rough draft of a very bad sci-fi novel. And he just said, okay, maybe, but what you might want to do is focus on another fantasy trilogy, just so that you've got a certain number under your belt, so that you've got a certain approach. You might have a particular readership. And then once you've sort of cemented that, if you want to diversify, you could look at it then. And as it was, I was literally just brainstorming with him. It wasn't a case of, how dare you tell me I can't write this? Because I think at the end of the day, you know, we pay these people because they're professionals and because they understand the market in ways that we don't. And therefore, when he said, you know, maybe focus on fantasy for a little bit longer, it would have been stupid of me to say, no, I'm not going to do that. Because how do I know? It's his job to know. And it's my job to write the books. So yeah, I mean, I would definitely pay attention to them because they are the people who understand the market. But also, I was absolutely, completely in love with an idea. I would fight for it, but and that's where it becomes, you know, to a certain extent, it becomes a collaboration because you have to find a way forward that is going to suit everybody.
And I guess, I mean, that's also kind of shopping it to other publishers at that point too. Like if you feel like you're set in a certain niche with a publisher, you're like, okay, let's kind of venture outside, try it with somebody else. I mean, do you think that the whole fitting into a mold is why authors use different names when they write other novels for different publishers? Like, is that a thing? I mean, I don't know any right off the top of my head that say they write one name in fantasy and they write with a different name in science fiction. But do you think that's maybe why some choose to do that? Or is it kind of just a rebranding because maybe something didn't work out in the past?
I think it's sort of compartmentalizing the work so people know at a glance what it's going to be. I mean, you look at Ian Banks, who wrote science fiction as Ian M. Banks. So you could immediately tell, is this a Banks thriller or is this a Banks sci-fi, just from the name on the back. Also, of course, the way he did it, all his books ended up still shelved together on the shelves, which I think is probably helpful. But I mean, you get other people who use a completely different name for different genres.
Robert Galbraith and J.K. Rowling.
Well, exactly that, yeah.
Yeah. I think you're right about the compartmentalization. If I were going to write something new, yeah, I would probably want to do a pseudonym. I mean, completely new, not just like a little element of fantasy. And if I'm writing erotica, let's say, then I'm going to be doing. I don't think you'd want to see that bit. I put 2 sex scenes in my first 2 books.
Single?
No.
Are you really?
What are these two?
That's it. No, I don't think erotica is going to be my thing. But yeah, either way, I would, you know, if I switched big mainstream genre, I would go probably pseudonym or even just something that's, I don't know, BC Galley, something like that.
50 Shades of Morally Grey.
Ooh.
Oh my gosh. All right. So David, I've got a question just for you. I gotta pick you out a little bit. So, and other people can chime in, obviously, but we kind of talked about this a little bit on our podcast chat. But do you feel that readers look at your book as something it isn't and judge it based on preconceptions? Because, you know, your cover resembles a certain Orbit release that will not be mentioned by name simply because the cover artist is the same, but the stories are vastly different.
Yeah, and you know, and is it grimdark? Is it low fantasy? It has no magic in it. Does that qualify? I don't know. I know that some people feel if there's no magic or there's no wizard in it anywhere, then it can't possibly be fantasy, which I happen to disagree with. I mean, well, Pete's former editor, perhaps. Yeah. So in terms of, you know, what is my particular book about? It's the story that I wanted to tell, which happened to involve no magic and happened to involve a clash of outlooks. And what I wanted to achieve was to have somebody who had very fixed ideals that were essentially morally good, but had no practical experience of the world, going up against a world that was morally grey, and then the effects of the two of them sort of on each other. In terms then of how it has been positioned and whether it fits in genres and all the rest of it, obviously that's kind of outside my control. Title and comparisons and cover and all of that were all decided for me, but it was done by people with a much, you know, and I suggest it's done by people with a much better command of the commercial side of it than me. and it has led to a few people saying your book was not what I expected. Most of them have said in a good way, but it's difficult to know. Had it been so, for example, I taken the independent route and published myself under the title, I would have given it with some art, perhaps not done by me on paint, but maybe I'd commissioned it, and with a blurb that I'd written myself. I mean, A, nobody would have bought it, but B, at least the people who bought it would probably have had like a one-to-one mapping of knowing what was in it. And they would have been the members of my family, and that's because I would have told them. But that really is it. So I'm not going to complain, which is obviously unlike me. But obviously people look at the cover and they go, "Oh, look, it looks like that other book we're not mentioning," which I hadn't heard of until somebody pointed that out to me, and then I Googled it and went, "Oh, look, it looks like my cover. That's nice." But the books are different, and I hope that once people have read both, I'm assuming you're not picking mine up to say, "Oh, look, it's exactly the same as that other one that we're not mentioning," obviously. Then I like to think there's
no specific reason I'm not mentioning it. It's just I'm sure people can figure.
We're all thinking it's somewhere. Nicholas Eames is going, what?
Yeah.
Ears are burning.
Strangest feeling.
Love it. There's some lawyer in the background just watching this as well. Like, come on, say something, please.
Oh my god!
I suppose in a way that's the same as libraries and bookshops looking at my cover art and reading my blurb and going, "Oh yeah, that's clearly YA because it was written by a woman."
Yeah.
And then I have found my own book in the kids section of libraries. I'm like, might want to move this.
Yeah.
There's no way that ends well, is there? Little Timmy gets the hammer
There's
out
no
of the
way that is going
toolbox.
to end well. Anything.
I read this in Godblind. Mom. Please go on.
Oh god.
So yeah, there is a strange, people make very strange assumptions based on things like titles and covers and the perceived gender of the author and what the blurb might say and stuff like that, and all of those things are outside of the writer's control. And to a certain extent, I mean, once they're published and they're out in the world, they're outside of the publisher's control as well. Because at the end of the day, when if Waterstones wants to put my book in YA, what is Harper Voyager going to do? Are they going to phone up every branch in the country and say, "Oh, does this one book right now? You need to make sure it's in the adult fantasy sector." Of course not. They can't. They can't do that for everyone's books. So yeah, but it does get a little bit frustrating, doesn't it, when people are making comparisons based on one particular aspect, and you're like, but just no.
Don't even get me started on the women can't write Grimdark comment or comments that have popped up over the years. That's a whole nother panel in itself, but
Yeah.
man.
Wait, you think none of you guys write YA?
Mentioned earlier puts a nix on that because it's like, well, out of the top 5, 2 of them are women, so I think they can.
Yeah.
But some people, you're right, are just so close-minded about that. It's like going to Subway and always ordering the same sandwich every time. It's like, that's fine, but at one point, you're going to get bored of it. And I think it's like, why not just try something new instead of having these preconceptions that are inherently wrong and stupid.
Inherently wrong and stupid. Yes.
And yeah. Like I said, I'm not going to get started.
You mean you don't want to just pop into the library once normalcy comes back, whenever that is, and see your book sitting in the YA section, and it has the librarian's recommendation tag under it.
No, that's fine. No, it's more the certain gender can't write this, or you can't do that. You can't do that. It's like, I can do what I want. Lots of other people can as well. If it doesn't work, then the audience will prove it, or a publisher won't pick it up. There are checks in place. And it's those people that have that closed-minded view are really missing out, to be honest, on some great fantasy.
Yeah.
We'll get rid of the preconception eventually. I mean, there was a time when you couldn't write fancy unless you had a beard. So, you know, it changes over time.
I told you, I'm trying. It's been a month now.
We've got to do what we can.
Yeah.
I drew mine on, but it's not
Rob was clean shaven this morning.
See, now
That's
that's
the real
proper
reason
fancy
why
one.
Pete's face isn't on there.
Yeah.
It's just
That's
beard.
why Pete has to It's just the beard.
Yeah. Looks
The
like
webcam's
Nasher
actually
from the
on.
Beano.
It's a little bit bushy at the moment. Actually.
Oh man.
Oh my gosh.
You could do a screen share, Pete, and just do us a quick sketch in paint of what your face looks like.
Just a round circle with lots of lines coming out of it for the hair.
For science.
I do actually look quite a lot like my profile picture on Twitter, so
Yeah,
well,
we'll go with that.
I look a lot like mine, which is to say a mean-spirited cat.
But speaking of which, I know a lot of comments early on were talking about your shirt, Dave. That's a fantastic shirt.
What, this old thing? This was a present from my sister, and I'm wearing it just in case she's watching YouTube, so she can go, that's the shirt I got him at last. Finally.
The one time he wears it.
Well, I've bolted it. We have a little like bathroom privacy lock on the study door at home to prevent any cats coming in, and also small children covered in jam. One of them was rattling the door handle earlier. Like, Daddy, what are you doing? There's nothing less charming.
Are you talking to the people on the computer then?
Well, you know, I regularly have conversations by myself in my little office, so they're quite used to that. And sometimes, you know, they're with video conferences, and sometimes it's just me talking to myself. There's
Right.
nothing weird about that, though, right?
We all do that.
Yeah. Right.
Characters are great conversation.
Oh yeah, characters. That would be a good idea.
I'm never alone, and yet so painfully alone.
That's
the last topic on the agenda.
Yeah.
I still haven't woken out, man. It's like it's not
You
even
need to get into your 1,000-yard stairs, just sort of.
Yeah.
That's it.
And our final section, the crushing weight of solitude.
Yay! That's true, Grimdark. Forever alone.
What genre is my ennui? That's a good question.
Oh man.
Oh,
Sartre. No, that's low fantasy, mate.
Right. So do y'all feel that these subgenres are only tied to fantasy? Do you think they would ever be somewhat tied to science fiction?
Well, they are, aren't they? I mean,
Are they?
originated with Warhammer. Grimdark originated with Warhammer 40k, didn't it? So,
Was it in the far Grimdark? Was in the far future or something? Isn't it?
But
Yeah,
it's
the Grimdarkness of space.
science.
in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only
it.
war.
I'm glad I got you all talking at the same time.
It's absolutely more.
I knew one topic would do it.
More care.
Let me get my squig out. No, not like that.
Well, I will say I haven't seen it really tied to anything since Warhammer. I've seen a lot of dark space operas, but I haven't anybody saying, "Oh, it's a really grimdark, novel." I've just seen it tied to fantasy. So I was just curious if any of you had seen, any science fiction novels in recent years that have actually had that moniker attached to them.
Outside of Warhammer, someone was telling me Gideon and Harrow the Ninth, which I haven't read yet. No, good. Okay, I'm not saying this.
Wait.
Someone told me the day.
There's a lesbian space necromancers,
They're too
right?
fun to be Grimdark,
Yeah.
surely.
Oh, right. Okay. That's right. Someone's saying, "Oh, they're really grimdark," but when I heard that, I was like, "That's going to be one of these phrases that's just thrown around because it's got a skeleton on the cover."
Yeah.
Okay. Then I retract that.
I mean, but you're not wrong. So many people have said that it's grimdark,
Right.
mainly because it has necromancers in it. But it's not. I mean, it's a science fiction like fantasy blend.
Right.
And it just has some dark moments, and it just happens to be in a dark environment, I guess.
The lights are off.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, the lights are just off. Yeah, basically.
Needs more candles. Is that?
Yeah, needs more candles, less skeletons. Yeah.
Yeah.
Nice. Okay.
But yeah, I mean, but to your point, yeah, a lot of people have said that it's grimdark, and I feel like that's just now a word just to throw around. It's not. It's just like saying everything's fantasy. I mean, it's it doesn't have an actual attachment to it anymore. What are you saying?
Yeah, I mean, when Gobline was first published, and I did my first panel, which was a Grimdark panel. So they pigeonholed me early on, and so like a few years ago, I've done panels and I've had discussions with other writers, and I think back then there was a definite feeling that Grimdark could only refer to this particular subgenre of fantasy. But I think if we go back to what we talked about right at the start, which is that it's a morally grey universe and you're going through shit with or without friends, that can apply to anything. I mean, if you take that, then one of the most grimdark books I've ever read in my life is a historical fiction novel called The Religion by Tim Willocks, which is set during the siege of Malta in the 16th century, I think it is. And I mean, the island of Malta was basically besieged for over a year, and the people were just living and dying in horrific conditions. And this book does not pull a single punch or give a single fuck. And it is just the epitome of grimdark, but it's a historical novel. It is not in any way fantasy. So I think if you're just taking those parameters, then you can apply it. You can apply it to all sorts of different things.
I agree. Yeah, especially with the Wikipedia definition of the amoral violence.
Yeah, I think we need to maybe let it loose from fantasy a little bit.
I'd be fine with it. Yeah, because I just feel,
Sorry, you will cut out then.
Oh yeah.
Go ahead. What was that, Anna?
No, you all cut out then. I couldn't hear anything. So.
No, everybody just went completely silent.
Yeah, it was just the way.
It's just such a good point.
Overloaded.
It was just it was a mic drop.
Yeah, it was mic drop.
But I mean, we do seem to be perhaps missing a classification for adult fantasy. Like adult fantasy is just too broad, and then you have high fantasy, and then you have grimdark, and there doesn't seem to be anything in between. You know, the notion of sort of whether it's moral grey areas, nihilism, that kind of thing. Whether it's, to Ben's point about, does it end badly or does it end with hope and redemption? You know, did the characters get what they want or do they get what they need? That sort of, you're picking at straws to an extent, but it does seem that if it doesn't fit like the Tolkien-esque epic high fantasy mold, people assume that it's grimdark. And that is, if you're not going to start applying a slightly more rigorous filter, then yeah, you're going to see it everywhere. But then if you get to sort of, is Warhammer 40,000 science fiction? Not really. Is Star Wars science fiction? So you can start kind of trying to slice up things with spaceships in it in the same way that you can with things with swords. And then, of course, something like Gideon the Ninth, you've got swords and spaceships. And the taxonomy breaks down completely. So
is it dark or light?
Yeah. How bright is the lighting, and are people being stabbed? But eventually you come back around to what is the purpose of the label? What is the, who's served by applying these labels? And is it readers trying to find the kind of books they will enjoy reading? And that's worthwhile. And as we've discussed, if a writer will write in a certain way, irrespective of the genre they're writing in, whether it is light fantasy or, science fiction or thriller or anything else, if you enjoy the way the person writes and you don't find the subject matter repellent, you're probably on fairly safe ground. And Ben's erotica novels, I think, will test that theory. But
just you wait, Ed. Just you wait.
Can we wait a long time, Ben? How about that? A really, really long time.
yeah, just calling everything grimdark doesn't help anybody.
Yeah,
because
it
means
doesn't really serve a purpose.
You can't find what it is you're looking for, and we just end up taking a step back and going, well, I like this author, and this author is apparently a bit like that author, and that author is apparently like, that author as well. And then you end up in my situation where somebody puts bloody Abercrombie on the back of your book, and everyone's going, no, it isn't. Idiot. He thinks he's Joe Abercrombie.
Yeah, no, they attach it directly to you, not your publisher or anything else. It's just like, oh, he thinks he's Joe Abercrombie. Okay, Mr. Debut novelist. Okay,
crazy
cat on the back of your book, like it's just a little insult. Oh, thinks he's Joe Abercrombie.
This guy, who does he think he is?
Yeah, and end up writing a note in it when they take it to their local second in Charles, and the next person can pick it up is like, oh, it's not Joe Abercrombie. Okay,
yeah.
I'd like to return this novel.
The author lied on the back cover.
Yeah, I think you're right there, Dave, because it is. I've got a taste for some real. I've written some real dark scenes, even bits where I don't know if this is wrong, but like you kind of step away from the keyboard and you're like, should I go see someone about what I've just written? Do I need to seek professional help? And I've had those moments. And I'm thinking, that to me. Yeah. Is pretty, the limit of dark in terms of writing it, and probably like consuming it. I could probably, because I'm not writing it, I could probably go slightly darker than that. But there are things out there that are either just too gratuitous or just too dark for me. And I think maybe the readers are kind of holding on to Grimdark in a way because it helps show that this is going to be in that portion of the spectrum that some people are going to get their stomachs churned by. And I think it's, it's that sort of stuff where it's like, I don't know, maybe it's a moniker for, sort of, this is going to be brutal. This is going to be epic. It's not going to be satisfying in places. Prepare yourself. It's going to be darker than just dark fantasy or low fantasy. So I think maybe people use it like that. But again, everyone's, spectrum and kind of threshold for that is completely different. Some people think a single stabbing is dark. And then they read mine.
But it is, man. It's so dark.
Well, it depends who's doing it.
Yeah.
And the type, yes, who's stabbing, who's being stabbed with
what are they being stabbed with? Yeah, which room were they in at the time?
Children stabbing adults,
No, that's dark, man.
Actually, too grimdark.
Too dark, too much. I'm sorry.
I had a conversation with somebody online a couple of weeks ago about this exact subject, and I think what they ended up saying was it doesn't, for them, what makes it grimdark is it's not necessarily what happens throughout the story, because I was sort of arguing that the Poppy War should be grimdark because it features genocide on a very brutal sort of visceral scale. But he was saying that for him, he didn't think of it so much as grimdark because while there was that sort of genocide going on, it wasn't really happening to the main character, and because he wasn't feeling that connected to the main character. So for him, what made it grimdark was the dark things happening to a character that he was emotionally invested in, rather than just happening in the world.
Yeah.
Which
we all have that story.
That seemed like a really good point to me. It's like, because he was arguing that Mark Lawrence's Red Sister was quite grimdark, and I was like, it's not grimdark at all. But because he was emotionally invested in the main characters and the things that were happening to them were pretty dark at times, he felt that was very grimdark.
Because it brings that sort of visceral action straight to you, like you say. Yeah.
On an emotional level that you're resonating with.
Yeah, the bad stuff's got to happen to the characters you root for. Otherwise everything's grimdark, isn't it? Lord of the Rings didn't end very well for the orcs, but nobody calls that grimdark, do they?
Bless them.
Sauron is the real victim here. Come on.
He was just misunderstood. He had a plan.
Although to be fair, it is hard to understand a giant eyeball.
Now we'll say,
I'm looking at Pete's image again.
He is
in the centre, he is very sort of like, dark eye Sauron.
Okay, now last question I've got. Where's the line between these genres and horror?
Ooh.
That's good. That's a good question. I struggle
with
this.
Horror is usually set in our world, isn't it? I don't think you get a lot of secondary world horror.
Yeah, I'd say that's a true statement.
I mainly consume horror through film and not books, and I don't know. I haven't seen any secondary world horror that I can think of in the last. No,
Actually, that's not. No, I should know this because I've bloody written some and I've forgotten it. Warhammer have a horror line now,
Yeah.
dedicated Warhammer horror imprint, which I've done a couple of stories for. But again, that, I mean, Warhammer's a genre in its own right, isn't it? Really, so I don't know, it really cares.
But isn't I'm trying to remember what somebody said it very pithily not that long ago about what the purpose of horror was in terms of like with the use that it serves the human psyche, and it's to I can't even remember now. I don't watch horror. I don't enjoy being scared or upset generally. I mean, I get enough of that in my day-to-day existence, so I don't really seek it out by means of recreation.
Living through a horror story right now.
Yeah.
Unfortunately,
I do keep coming back to, like, well, funnily enough, Neil Gaiman talking about Coraline and saying how, you know, Coraline is like a horror book for kids, and it's not, because that upset lots of parents inevitably. And his point at the time was, a horror book for kids isn't about teaching kids that dragons exist; it's about teaching them that dragons can be defeated. And that was the message, because the darkness is out there, and you are going to experience it on some level in some time. And the better prepared you are in advance, the better. So that was his pitch for, you know, horror for children. I've never read Coraline. I think I'd be too scared.
They're actually doing a live reading of it for the New York Public Library. I think Gaiman did 4 chapters. LeVar Burton's doing 4. Rosario Dawson's doing a few, and Dakota Fanning, I think, is doing the last 2.
That's
so
cool.
if you have free time,
I will also be avoiding that.
I mean, maybe as
like kids tell you.
Go ahead.
Sorry, but you know, I mean, the thing with like kids being scared and stuff, kids love being scared. Kids tell each other ghost stories. Kids want to go on roller coasters. You know, kids like being scared. There's something really visceral about being scared, and there's something that's quite visceral about horror, and also about, you know, epic fantasy. And I think, coming back to the question, you know, it is a really blurred line. It's as blurred as the line between epic fantasy and grimdark. You know, grimdark and horror. You know, they all contain a lot of really similar elements. You know, things that are genuinely frightening, things that make you extremely uncomfortable or might make you squeamish. I think part of the appeal of things like horror and thrillers and grimdark is that, in a way, it kind of takes us back to that feeling of when we were kids and we were scaring ourselves deliberately because it was fun. Because that's what it comes down to, isn't it? Is it whatever you're reading, whatever genre of whatever it is you're reading, you're doing it for fun. I just think sometimes people get so caught up on the labels and stuff like that they forget why it is they're reading a book or why they love a book. It's like, just have fun, you know. And if what you find to be fun is fictitious mass genocide, then great. You know, it does need to be fictitious, though, people. Okay.
Yeah. Please.
Don't go out and do
Please.
this. It's not a recommendation.
I think we've got a pull quote for the panel now. If what you enjoy is ... genocide.
Yeah, I think you're right though, because when we're kids, we're so, generally speaking, you know, we're protected. You know, we don't see the whole world. We don't know things. Oh, you'll find out when you're older, that sort of thing. Then when I know, I'm still waiting. But you know, in that case, it's just like you kind of want to tell ghost stories, and you want to find out where, you know, what's in the dark area in the Lion King and things like that. I'm still not over that either.
No.
And so I think it's that element of wanting to break out and explore and to wander into these dark places. And that's why horror films and books and films are great, because we can do that from the comfort of our couch without the worry of actually being stabbed or
it's from the position of safety, right? That's exactly the thing. Yeah, the genocide is taking place over there.
Yeah, somewhere over that hill. So it's kind of like, it's that aspect to me is the beauty of the escapism of books. And obviously people want to, you know, they know there's darkness out there and they want to explore that. And that's why people love horror. They want to be disturbed and thrilled. So I think if you're setting out and writing a book and you're saying, right, this book is going to be about, you know, X and Y, and it's going to disturb and horrify people, then you're not blurring the line between horror and fantasy necessarily. You're writing a fantasy horror. And some people might look at that and go, because it's dark and it's got genocide and it's got this and it disturbs me, it's grimdark. Again, it's the reader's definition, but I think it's, yeah, and it's right, it's what you set out to write for the purpose of the, whatever the purpose is.
It's all genocide.
Genocide and wading through shit. If we can take anything away from the panel.
We've nailed it down. We can go ahead and let Mark know.
We've nailed the genre. There we go. Grimdark is genocide and wading through shit.
Yeah, that's it. It took an hour and a bit, but that's it. If the five of us aren't at the top of Mark's list now, after this with Anna. Well, Anna's already there.
Yeah, Anna's already there. So she's got money in the bank now. So
yeah.
Well, guys, we're at about an hour 15, so I want to go ahead and see if we can do a little wrap up. But what I want to do is everybody take an opportunity to kind of plug a book. Peter, I'll hold up a novel for you since you still don't have an opportunity to show it.
Apparently not. No.
Should have
But
printed out.
we'll just kind of go across like we did when we did the intros. So, Pete, if you want to start.
Yeah, okay, I can do that. So, Priest of Bones, out from Joe Fletcher Books in the UK and Ace Rock in the United States. If you like gangsters and you like fantasy, this is the book for you. It's The Godfather with Swords, is what I pitched it as.
All right, Dave.
Nice. Yeah, this is my book is The Black Hawks. It is, I don't know, low fantasy, non-magical low fantasy, equipping rogues, violence, cynicism, and lots of people calling each other names. It's not Joe Abercrombie, Scott Lynch, or any of the other ones.
Don't sound too enthusiastic there.
There will be more. It's not a standalone.
To unpopular demand or belief, it's not standalone.
Dear Robin Hobbit is not a standalone.
Oh,
Have
God.
you got the title yet for the sequel?
Yes, it's Untitled Book 2.
Good. Yeah, works well. I like it.
All right, Ben.
What's the main thing to talk about around at the moment is I've got, I choose this on my iPad, but I've got that way Chasing Graves at the moment. My brand new trilogy is free for the next 5 days as of today. So it's on Amazon. Free, that one there, he's got it. See, I don't have them. I ship them all out. That bad boy right there. It's about ghosts. The main character dies in pretty much almost the first couple of pages. So it's not a spoiler. It's in the blurb. So if you want to follow a character who dies a violent death and then has to fight for his own freedom from beyond the grave as a ghost in a society that is about slavery of ghosts, then it's Egyptian themed. It's the first time I've kind of delved into that world, which I loved because I've always had a fascination with Egyptian mythology. So it's free. Even if you hate it and it's crap, it's free.
Let's get that little orange tag on Amazon, guys.
Yeah, it's free. And you can find that just at bengalley.com. That's where all my social media links, all my other books, whatever you like, is there.
Fantastic. Rob?
I'll pitch my my latest trilogy, which is there you go. That's the first book in the trilogy, Along the Road to Zed. The trilogy is called The War Eternal. Book one is about a young girl who is she's trained to be a weapon for her emperor from birth, and then it starts at the end of the war where she loses, and then she's stripped of her magic and thrown into the pit, which is a prison, and she has to try and survive without her magic and against all the other inmates and whatever other demons she finds along the way. That's sort of a high fantasy trilogy. Here's cover 2. It's complete in like 9 days. The third book's out in 9 days.
All right, Anna?
I pitched.
So Bloodchild, which is book 3 of the Goblin trilogy, is now out. It's also out in baby paperback as well. So if that is your jam, then you can get it like that. It is the whole trilogy is the story of a war of conquest between 2 different countries and their opposing sets of gods. And it's basically the story of how far would you go and what exactly will you do to save the people that you love. There's a very bad lady with a hammer. There is a very cheeky half mortal, half immortal god, and there are very many painful shenanigans.
Oh gosh,
and genocide.
We almost got through an entire con without saying shenanigans. I don't know if anybody's seen Super Troopers, but shenanigans. All right, guys. Well, I just want to, first of all, thank all the panelists that came on today and spent some time chatting about Grimdark, Grimheart, and low fantasy. And thank everybody for tuning in that has checked it out. Obviously, we have several more hours to go. But if anybody wants to rewatch this, it will be on my YouTube channel that you're tuning into now. But guys, thank y'all so much for coming and chatting. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, David.
Yeah,
amazing
job.
I hope the rest of the day goes well.
We'll find
You've
out.
done a great job.
I just hope you don't run out of coffee, David. I don't know how you're doing this, man.
And maybe at some point we'll be able to see Peter's face.
At some point.
Y'all enjoy the rest of your weekend.
And
Thanks a lot.
you.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Bye.
Cheers.